Everest gets the glory, the photos, the lines of clients clipping into fixed ropes like it's a high-altitude theme park. But there is another mountain, just a little lower, that kills far more efficiently. They call it Dhaulagiri, the White Mountain. On paper, it is only the 7th highest peak on Earth. In reality, its death rate is around 16%, more than 5 times deadlier than Everest. I learned that the hard way. Our expedition came in chasing a different dream. Everyone down in Kathmandu talked about Everest. Everest documentaries played in hotel lobbies. Everest summit photos covered the walls. But the old Sherpas, the ones with deep lines in their faces, lowered their voices when you asked about Dhaulagiri. Too many bodies there, one of them said. Not enough stories. From the air, the mountain looks almost beautiful. A perfect white pyramid rising alone above rolling foothills in western Nepal. But as our helicopter circled the massif, the beauty turned hostile. Steep ridges shot up like knife blades. The south face towered 4,000 meters above the valley, a vertical continent of broken rock and ice where entire Japanese and American teams had vanished in avalanches. We weren't going to touch that face. Too suicidal. Our route would follow the standard northwest ridge, the easiest way up Dhaulagiri. That's what the brochure said. But the statistics told another story. Dozens of bodies, many swallowed by crevasses or buried under Serac Falls. Base camp sat on a broken glacier at 4,700 meters, ringed by hanging ice cliffs and black rock walls. You could feel the difference from Everest immediately. No crowds, no commercial tents with logos, just a handful of small expeditions. Thin lines of prayer flags, and the constant thunder of avalanches rumbling down from unseen couloirs high above. At night, we lay in our sleeping bags, listening to the mountain clearing its throat. Some avalanches sounded distant like distant artillery. Others shook the ice under our mats and sent powder seeping under the tent flaps. Every time a roar came closer, someone would whisper into the dark, "Not us, not yet." Dhaulagiri doesn't kill like Everest. It doesn't wait for you on a single step or a famous bottleneck. Here, the whole mountain is a weapon. The ridges are steep, the weather turns without warning, and most deaths don't happen in heroic summit pushes. They happen in the middle of the maze, in ordinary camps, when people think they are safe. We came here thinking we understood risk because we had read about Everest. By the time we reached Camp 2, we realized Everest had lied to us. The real lessons about death in the death zone were waiting on Dhaulagiri. You're about to climb this forgotten 8,000er with me. From the first steps on the glacier, through the avalanches that erased entire tents in seconds, to the moment we finally understood why so many climbers never come back from the White Mountain. If stories like this pull you in, please subscribe now. It seriously helps a small channel like ours keep making these deep dive survival videos. And if this opening already gave you chills, hit the like button before we rope up and head to Camp 1. Dhaulagiri isn't just another white pyramid on a map. It is the 7th highest mountain on Earth at 8,167 meters, rising an almost absurd 7,000 meters straight up from the Kali Gandaki Valley floor. Its south and west faces are 4,600-meter walls of rock and ice that make even seasoned Himalayan climbers uncomfortable just looking at them. On Everest, people talk about crowds, queues, and traffic jams in the death zone. On Dhaulagiri, there are no crowds. There is only exposure and a fatality rate that hovers around 16 deaths for every 100 successful summits, far worse than Everest's single-digit percentages. The mountain is infamous for its steep ice falls, hidden crevasses, and sudden storms that roll in from the west and bury camps that looked safe a few hours before. Most expeditions stick to the so-called normal route on the northeast ridge, the line first climbed by the Swiss-Austrian Nepali team in 1960. Typically, they establish base camp at about 4,700, 4,800 meters, then 4 higher camps, around 5,900 meters on a wind-scoured col, 6,400 meters above steep avalanche-prone slopes, and further up exposed ridges leading toward the summit dome. On paper, it is the easiest way up Dhaulagiri. In reality, advance camps sometimes aren't even used at night because they sit directly in the path of regular avalanches. That is the mountain you are about to climb in this story. Not Everest with its ladders and crowds, but a colder, emptier, more honest killer, a place where a small mistake in a quiet camp can be more lethal than a storm at the summit. From base camp to the death zone, through collapsing seracs and disappearing tents. This is the full descent into the White Mountains' reputation as a peak that Everest climbers whisper about, but rarely truly understand. The first time I saw Dhaulagiri, it didn't look real. From the window of the small plane rattling its way toward Pokhara, it floated above the clouds like a detached piece of Antarctica, a white block of ice and rock cut clean out of the sky. Everest sits in a jagged skyline. Dhaulagiri stands almost alone. On the map, it is just a name. 8,167 meters, 7th highest mountain on Earth, part of a massif in western Nepal. On the ground, it is something else entirely. It rises almost 7,000 meters straight up from the Kali Gandaki Valley, one of the deepest gorges on the planet, its flanks dropping down on both sides like the walls of a colossal white fortress. Everyone in Kathmandu wanted to talk about Everest. Travel agencies had glossy posters of the Khumbu icefall and people in bright down suits queuing at the Hillary step. But when I mentioned Dhaulagiri, the man behind one cluttered desk paused, looked at me, and slowly shook his head. Everest is busy, he said. Dhaulagiri is different. The approach alone reminded us of that. We drove west, away from the usual tourist routes, into a narrower, dustier Nepal, through Beni, then along roads that barely deserved the name, until the vehicle could go no further. From there, it was boots and mule caravans. The trail followed the Mayagdi Kola, a river that churned milky white from glacial melt, carving its way between Dhaulagiri and its neighboring peaks. The villages grew smaller, the fields steeper, terraced into impossible slopes that looked ready to slide into the river at the first big rain. We passed through forests where moss hung off the branches like old hair, and where the sun rarely reached the ground. Every night, as we climbed a little higher, the mountain drew closer. At first it was just a glimpse between clouds, then a smear of white above a ridge. Finally, a full face. Ice cliffs fractured by seracs, ridges sharpened by wind, and long avalanche scars running down gullies like white rivers frozen mid-flow. Our Italian base camp lay at around 3,600 meters on a grassy clearing below the north face, a place where the glacier had once come but had long retreated. Here, for the first time, we had an unobstructed view of the wall that would guard the route to the main base camp and to the mountain itself. It was not yet Dhaulagiri's summit pyramid, but a prelude, broken ice falls, hanging seracs, and black rock towers that caught every last bit of afternoon light before dropping us into shadow. At night, we could hear the mountain moving. It sounded like distant thunder at first, then like the rumble of a passing train, even though there were no tracks within 100 kilometers. Avalanches tore down the unseen slopes of the north face, sometimes visible as ghostly white plumes under the moon, sometimes only audible as a growl that lasted too long to be comforting. Every time a larger roar echoed through the valley, conversation in camp stopped. We counted the seconds until the sound faded. No one said it out loud, but we were all asking the same question. When the route turns into that, will it be our turn? From Italian base camp to main Dhaulagiri base camp, the trail left soil and grass behind and stepped fully onto glacier. We picked our way over rubble and ice, weaving between seracs on the east side and a steep rock tower known as the Eiger of Dhaulagiri on the west. Here the landscape stopped looking like Earth and started looking like a frozen battlefield. Old camp platforms cut into the ice, half-buried tent poles sticking out of snow, a rusted gas canister lying on its side like an unexploded shell. This was where other expeditions had passed, some victorious, some not. We knew from the statistics that Dhaulagiri's fatality rate sat somewhere around 16%, far higher than Everest's. We also knew that many of those deaths happened in places just like this, in the icefall, on the way between camps, under slopes that looked stable 1 hour and collapsed the next. There was no single famous death zone here. The entire route felt like one long, stretched-out danger zone. Main base camp at roughly 4,700–4,800 meters, was nothing more than a flat spot carved into the ice across from that dark rock tower. Our tents looked comically small, neon dots scattered on a broken white floor, with the northeast ridge rising in the distance like the spine of some buried monster. This ridge, the so-called normal route, was supposed to be our way up, slightly less technical than the south face E, but exposed to wind-loaded slabs and avalanches where snow from the north gets dumped onto the eastern side. The leader gathered us in the mess tent on the first night. On the table, he spread a laminated route photo, base camp at the toe of the glacier, Camp 1 on a wind-scoured shelf around 5,900 meters, Camp 2 above steep, avalanche-prone slopes near 6,400 meters, Camp 3 somewhere near 7,200 meters on the upper ridge. "Remember," he said, tapping the line above Camp 2, "Dhaulagiri doesn't forgive bad timing. The wind brings all the snow from the north onto this side and stacks it into slabs. 4 expeditions have had fatal accidents right here." His finger stopped on a section of the photo where the slope looked innocently smooth, almost gentle. We already knew what that meant. Smooth snow at high altitude is often just a disguise for a trap. That night, as we lay in the thin air of base camp, most of us weren't thinking about the summit yet. We were thinking about that smooth slope above Camp 2, about the cracks that would propagate unseen beneath our feet, and about the fact that on this mountain, more people had been taken by avalanches than by falls or altitude sickness. We had come here for a story worse than Everest. We were starting to understand what that actually meant. If you've watched this far and want to hear the rest of what Dhaulagiri did to us high above this base camp, please consider subscribing. We're a tiny channel trying to get from 100 to 1,000 people who love this kind of deep, brutal mountain story. And if you're still here, hit the like button now so this video can reach more people who think Everest is the whole story. From base camp, the route to Camp 1 looked almost harmless on the map, a gradual line across the glacier, then up to a col around 5,900 meters, where we would pitch our first high camp. Standing on the ice, it felt very different. The glacier between base camp and the northeast saddle was a maze, broken, uneven, and full of traps. In the early morning, the surface froze hard enough to hold our weight, a brittle crust that cracked like glass under our crampons. By midday, that crust turned to slush, snow bridges sagged, and crevasses that had been invisible at dawn opened into black wounds. We moved out as a rope team, headlamps cutting cones of light through the cold dark. The first few hours passed in the rhythm every climber knows: step, pull, breathe, step, pull, breathe. The mountain loomed above, a silhouette against a sky that was just beginning to hint at a pale blue. Somewhere up there, beyond the ridges we could see, lay the long line to Camp 2, Camp 3, and the summit dome. But for now, our world was only the ice at our feet. The glacier creaked and sighed under us. Here and there, small cracks split the surface, radiating outward with a dry snapping sound as if something deep below were shifting in its sleep. Every time we crossed a suspicious patch, we spread out, keeping the rope just tight enough that if one of us punched through, the others could arrest the fall before it became a full plunge into the dark. Halfway to the col, the terrain steepened. We had to weave between bulges of ice, some the size of houses, some like the broken teeth of some enormous animal, pointing toward the sky. Seracs towered above us, blocks of ice fractured by gravity and sun, ready to peel off and crash down with no warning. We moved quietly, as if noise might wake them. One of the Sherpas, Pasang, stopped at a narrow bridge over a crevasse so deep that our headlamp beams simply disappeared into blue. He looked back at us and smiled the kind of smile that says, "This is fine, and this is terrible," at the same time. "Fast here," he said. We crossed one by one, the rope cutting a shallow groove in the snow, the hollow echo of our steps amplified by the gap beneath. By the time the sun hit us, we were on the steeper slope leading to the col east of base camp, where Camp 1 would be built. The heat turned the surface mushy. Our crampons balled up with wet snow, making each step heavier, each kick less secure. We zigzagged up slowly, cutting a diagonal track across the slope, careful never to bunch up in one place. From below, This slope had looked like just another white ramp. Up close, we saw the buried fracture lines, subtle waves under the snow where old avalanches had released in the past. Here and there, the distinctive whump of settling snow rolled under our feet, the sound of a slab compressing, warning us that the layers were not entirely bonded. We all heard it. No one said anything. Camp 1 sat on a small, flat section of glacier just below the corniced edge of the col, at around 5,900 meters. It wasn't a comfortable place. No high camp ever really is. But the view gave us the illusion of control. Base camp now far below, the long line of the glacier stretching back down toward the valley, and above us, the northeast ridge finally visible, as more than a shape on a photograph. We pitched the tents with extra care. Snow anchors went deep. Guy lines were tightened until the fabric hummed in the wind. This camp would see us multiple times as we followed the familiar Himalayan pattern of climbing high and sleeping low, going up and down the same dangerous terrain to give our bodies a chance to adapt. That afternoon, as we sat melting snow for water, a distant roar rolled across the glacier. We unzipped the tent doors and leaned out. Far to the right, on another face we would never climb, an entire slope had released, an avalanche pouring down in slow motion, dragging clouds of powder that billowed out wide at the bottom. It didn't hit any camp. It didn't take any lives, but it reminded us that everything around us, every slope we stepped on, had the potential to do exactly that. The radios crackled with snippets from other teams. One group had turned back just above Camp 1 the year before, after fresh snow made the slope to Camp 2 too unstable. Another had lost tents at Camp 2 when a smaller avalanche swept horizontally across the ridge, ripping fabric and gear into the void. Stories like that travel quickly on 8,000ers. They float through mess tents and along fixed lines, a kind of oral map of where the mountain has been merciful and where it has not. That night at Camp 1, the air felt thinner, sharper, the stars more aggressive in their brightness. The wind never fully stopped. It tugged at the tents, flapped loose guy lines, and hissed across the snow like sand over a desert dune. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, interrupted by the sound of our own breathing and the occasional crack of shifting ice. Somewhere far below, in the flat world, people still believed Everest was the peak that defined danger. Up here, on a small shelf of ice beneath Dhaulagiri's northeast ridge, we were starting to understand that this mountain killed in quieter, less cinematic ways, not with crowds and queues and famous bottlenecks, but with a single misjudged camp placement, a single safe-looking slope, a single avalanche in the middle of an ordinary night. By morning, the tents were rimed with frost inside and out. When we stepped out, the ridge above looked closer, almost inviting. But between us and the next camp lay that smooth slope everyone talked about, the place where many teams had tried to escape the wind on the ridge and moved their tents just a little to the east, onto the loaded face that had buried more than one climber while they slept. The route to Camp 2 would show us exactly why Dhaulagiri had earned its reputation, and why so many climbers who had easier summits like Everest on their resume never came back from the White Mountain. From Camp 1, the slope above looked smooth. That was the first warning. The route to Camp 2 climbed broad snowfields toward a shoulder of the northeast ridge, aiming for a camp somewhere around 6,400 meters, high enough to feel the pull of the death zone, low enough to pretend we were still in control. Descriptions and expedition notes called it a gradual climb on broad snow slopes to a natural arête. Gradual, broad. On Dhaulagiri, those words hide as many bodies as steep and technical. We left Camp 1 in darkness again, headlamps slicing through wind-blown snow. The first few hundred meters were just an extension of the slope we'd climbed the day before. Firm snow, occasional patches of ice, the familiar crunch of crampon teeth biting into the surface. But then the angle eased slightly, the terrain opened up, and we stepped onto what looked like a giant white balcony sloping gently up toward the ridge. The moment my boots hit that smoother snow, I felt it. A subtle hollow under the surface. The kind of sound you learn to recognize after enough seasons in avalanche country. Snow on top of snow, layers that had not fully bonded. Behind me, The rope tugged as the rest of the team followed the track. "Pasang," a few meters back, murmured just loud enough for me to hear. "This place and we go fast." We moved in a rising traverse, cutting a diagonal line across the slope so that we wouldn't climb directly under the steeper part of the face. Under our feet, the snow alternated between firm and hollow, patches of wind-packed slab and softer, weaker layers that collapsed with a dull whoomp as we stepped. Each of those sounds sent a little shock up the spine, a reminder that the entire mountainside could be one large trigger waiting for the right weight, the right sound, the right moment. We weren't the first team to feel that tension here. Over the radio, people had told us stories. One season, after days of unstable weather, an avalanche had swept across this very slope and buried Camp 2, killing 2 experienced Spanish climbers as they waited out a storm inside their tents. They hadn't been pushing for the summit. They hadn't been crossing any famous bottleneck. They were just doing what we were planning to do, sitting tight, waiting for the mountain to give them a window. When we stopped to catch our breath, we could see the remnants of old camps, shallow platforms cut into the slope, fragments of broken bamboo wands, bits of weathered cord frozen into the snow. Evidence of all the times people had stood in exactly this spot, thinking exactly what we were thinking. "Looks okay. We'll be fine here." The wind picked up around mid-morning, dragging streamers of snow off the ridge above and dumping them onto the very slope we were crossing. With each gust, fine crystals hissed across the surface, building tiny drifts behind every bump and rock. We knew what that meant. The slab we were walking on was getting thicker, heavier, more prone to cracking. We roped a little tighter. We spaced out more. No one wanted to be bunched together if the slope decided to move. At one point, the leader stopped and drove his ice axe straight down into the snowpack. At first, it cut easily. Then it hit something denser, a hard layer maybe 40 centimeters below the surface, exactly the kind of interface where a fracture could start and propagate. He looked up at the ridge, at the cornices hanging above us like frozen waves ready to break. Then he looked back at us. "We don't stop here," he said. "Camp 2 goes as high as we can safely push it, closer to the R8, less under the direct fire." So we kept moving, diagonally, always diagonally, climbing but also escaping, trying to get out from under the worst of the load. The air thinned. Our breathing grew louder inside our hoods. Step, whoomp, step, whoomp. Around 6,200 meters, we reached what some teams call Lower Camp 2, a slightly flatter spot where a few tents could fit more comfortably. Several expeditions had stopped here in recent years, unwilling to push higher on days when fresh snow made the upper slopes too dangerous. You could see why. The angle eased, visibility was better, and the psychological comfort of being off the steepest part was tempting. But Pasang shook his head. "Here also died people," he said quietly. He pointed to a shallow depression where the snow looked subtly different, slightly collapsed. "Old avalanche crown line. Camp go there. Wind bring snow. Slab. Then, gone." We pushed on. The last section to our chosen Camp 2 at about 6,400 meters climbed toward a subtle ridge, an arête that would at least give some protection from slides coming from one side. The snow here was still loaded, but under our feet the whumps were less frequent, the layers a little more bonded. Avalanches, like electricity, prefer the path of least resistance. We were trying to find a place where that path did not run directly through our tents. By the time we hacked out platforms, the clouds had started to build from below, creeping up the valley like slow, gray water filling a basin. From our perch, we could no longer see base camp, just the tops of other ridges poking through a sea of white. We were now fully inside Dhaulagiri's world, a place of wind, snow, and angles where every decision about where to stand, where to sleep, where to run a rope might be the difference between a near miss and a memorial article. We reinforced the tent walls with snow blocks, built small ridges on the uphill side to deflect any loose sloughs that might pour down, and oriented the doors away from the prevailing wind. It felt meticulous, almost obsessive. But we knew the story of the 2 Spaniards buried at Camp 2 while they sat inside their tent during a storm. and of other climbers who had been killed by slides even lower, sometimes as far down as base camp. On Dhaulagiri, avalanches respected no boundaries. That night, lying in my sleeping bag, I listened. The wind pressed against the tent, then let go. Snow hissed across the flysheet. Every now and then, a deeper rumble rolled in from higher up the face, an avalanche somewhere we couldn't see. Each time, I held my breath, counting the seconds, waiting to feel whether the vibration would reach us. People often think death on 8,000ers is all about the summit, running out of oxygen, collapsing a few meters from the top, or being caught in a storm on the final ridge. But up here, at Camp 2 on Dhaulagiri, the lesson was simpler and much colder. You can die lying down. You can die doing nothing at all. All it takes is being in the wrong place when the mountain decides to shift its weight. We had built our camp in what we hoped was the less wrong place. Soon, the mountain would show us whether that was enough. Above Camp 2, Dhaulagiri stopped pretending to be gentle. From our little shelf at around 6,400 meters, the route climbed directly toward the northeast ridge, following a line that grew steeper, sharper, and more exposed with every meter gained. The broad, loaded slopes were below us now. Up here, the mountain traded buried slabs for something more primitive, gravity and exposure. We left Camp 2 before dawn again, headlamps pointed at a dark wall where the ridge vanished into the night. The wind had calmed slightly, but the cold was deeper. A dry, metallic cold that bit through gloves and into the bones of our fingers. Breath froze on eyelashes. Each inhale felt like sand being dragged into the lungs. The first section climbed a narrowing snow ramp, then cut up onto the spine of the northeast ridge itself. Here, our world shrank to a line of boot prints no wider than a dining room table, with nothing but air dropping thousands of meters away on either side. To the left, the north face fell away into shadow, a long, cold void. To the right, the east side dropped toward unseen glaciers, slopes that, in bad seasons, collected all the snow the wind ripped off the north side and turned it into unstable slabs. We knew from other climbers' reports that, in recent years, many expeditions had avoided the very top of this ridge by traversing out onto an ice field on the north face, cutting across a 500-600 meter section that looked like a frozen sea. It was technically easier than staying on the sharp crest, less rock, more snow, but it came with its own price. Crevasses, seracs, and the sense that you were stepping out onto the roof of a building made entirely of cracked glass. Our leader had made his choice months earlier, reading accident reports and listening to veterans who had seen too many people die under loaded slopes. "We stay on the ridge as much as possible," he had said. "The wind is your enemy on the east side and your enemy on the north face. Up here, it's also your friend. It strips the snow off the crest, less to slide." So we followed the line of least death. The ridge steepened. Snow turned to mixed ground, hard névé with rock outcrops poking through. We front-pointed with crampons, axes sunk into a surface that felt more secure than the wide slope below, but far more psychological. Down there, a slide might bury you. Up here, a fall would simply not stop. By mid-morning, the sun finally reached us. It illuminated a section of ridge that rose ahead like the spine of a white dragon, culminating in a series of small ledges between about 7,000 and 7,300 meters where Camp 3 could be pitched. From far away, those ledges looked flat. Up close, they were fragments, just barely wide enough scraps of safety carved into steep ground. We had read the numbers. Camp 3 is where the oxygen is low enough that your brain starts to make mistakes in slow motion, where a misplaced crampon, a poorly tied knot, or a lazy anchor isn't just a slip. It's the end of the story. We climbed in silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal on ice, the soft chime of carabiners, the dull thud of axes. At one point, the ridge narrowed to a true knife edge. To our right, a small cornice hung in space. Its underside lit a faint blue. No one stepped near it. We hugged the left side, the safe side, the side that had more rock under the snow. On Everest in recent seasons, people had walked single file along similar edges near the summit. Lines of climbers clipped to a single rope anchored through cornices that later collapsed. Here, there were no lines, No crowds, just a handful of us threading our way between exposure and collapse. Around 7,300 meters, we reached the first ledges flat enough to imagine a tent. They weren't big. They weren't comfortable. But they were somewhat protected from slides coming straight down the face, and, most importantly, they were on the ridge, not out on the loaded slopes to the east. We spent hours carving those ledges out, chopping and shoveling until each tent platform was a careful compromise between flatness and not cutting too far into the snow. Dig too little and you sleep on a slope. Dig too much and you risk undercutting your own support. By the time the tents were up, the weather had begun to turn. Clouds boiled up from the valley, shrouding the lower part of the ridge and leaving us in a world reduced to a few meters of nylon and the sound of the wind. Inside, we fired up stoves, melted snow, forced down dehydrated food in slow, mechanical bites. Every breath felt like work. It was here, in these cramped tents at Camp 3, that we really felt Dhaulagiri's personality. On Everest, at similar altitudes, there are often multiple camps from different expeditions, lines of tents, fixed routes, and a sense that you are part of some larger migration moving through the death zone. On Dhaulagiri, we were very aware that only a few teams touched these ledges each season. The statistics we had read back home, about Dhaulagiri's relatively high death-to-summit ratio compared to more popular peaks, suddenly felt less like numbers and more like whispers from these walls. Through thin tent fabric we could hear the ridge groan and hum under the wind. Now and then, a deeper thud came from somewhere out on the north face, a serac falling, a piece of the ice field breaking away, a sound that reminded us why so many guides warned against the traverse below. Night at Camp 3 was not sleep, so much as intervals of half-consciousness between checks on the anchors and the stove. Every few hours, someone would shake the frost off the tent poles, listen for changes in the wind, make sure the guy lines were still under tension. You could feel the altitude in everything, in the way thoughts slowed down, in the way simple tasks like closing a zipper made your forearm muscles ache. Somewhere higher, beyond our line of sight, the summit dome waited. The usual plan was simple on paper. From Camp 3, rest-y, climb to a higher Camp 4 or go directly for the summit if the weather was perfect and the team strong. But Dhaulagiri's reputation came from all the times reality didn't match the plan, when climbers launched summit pushes in marginal conditions, or when they came back down tired and were caught by storms, avalanches, or simple mistakes on this very ridge. We lay there, listening to the fabric flutter, feeling the ridge vibrate gently, picturing every story we had ever heard about climbers lost on descent, about bodies later recovered from gullies and crevasses, about teams forced to leave their dead where they fell because moving them would have meant dying too. Up here, past 7,000 meters, the margin narrowed down to almost nothing. We had done everything we could to tip the odds. Stay on the ridge, avoid the slabs, keep the camps as safe as any camp on an 8,000er can be. But even as we tried to sleep, we knew the truth every climber on Dhaulagiri eventually understands. The mountain doesn't care how carefully you read the guidebooks. It doesn't care how many rotations you've done, how good your gear is, or what you've already survived on other peaks. It only cares about one thing: whether you are in the wrong place at the wrong moment when it decides to move. We were now close enough to the summit that we could almost feel its pull. But on Dhaulagiri, that pull has dragged many climbers one step too far, onto cornices that collapsed, onto slopes that cracked, into storms that sealed off the way down. As the night deepened over Camp 3, we weren't thinking about glory or photos or records anymore. We were thinking about the simple, brutal question that defines every real 8,000er climb. Can we get up, and can we get back down, before this mountain decides it has had enough of us? Summit plans on Dhaulagiri are always written in pencil. The mountain likes to erase them. From Camp 3, our original idea was textbook: rest a few hours, then climb to a small Camp 4 around 7,500 meters, spend a short night there, and go for the summit at first light. The forecast on paper gave us a narrow window. One day of lighter winds between two pulses of the jet stream that were hammering the higher ridges across the Himalaya. But forecasts at sea level and reality at 7,000 meters are two different planets. By the time we were boiling water inside the cramped tents at Camp 3, the wind had already started to rise. It wasn't yet the full-aimed screaming blast that pins climbers to the mountain, but it was enough to shake the fabric, to make the tent poles flex and creak. Snow hissed constantly outside, a fine, dry spray carried by gusts that never seemed to fully stop. Over the radio, another team higher on the ridge debated what to do. Their voices were ragged with altitude. "Wind may be 40, 50 kilometers per hour now," one climber said. "Stronger higher. If we go to C4, we commit. No coming back down if jet arrives early." Our leader listened, eyes closed, counting seconds between gusts. He looked at the barometer, at the thin line on the graph, at the summit silhouette reduced to a dark outline above. Then he made the call that would define the rest of the climb. "We go from Camp 3, he said. "No Camp 4. One long push, up and down before the winds fully arrive." It was a brutal plan. From around 7,200, 7,300 meters, all the way to 8,167 meters and back in a single continuous effort, in air with roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level. But it came with one advantage: fewer hours spent in a place where avalanche hazard and exposure were both waiting to punish anyone too slow. We left at night. Headlamps flicked on like tiny stars along the ridge. The cold outside the tent was immediate and absolute, a full-body slap that made fingers go numb in seconds if they were bare. We wore every layer we had, downsuits, multiple gloves, goggles fogging as soon as we breathed. The summit route from Camp 3 followed the ridge upward, then traversed sections where the ridge dissolved into steep snowfields leading onto the summit dome. Some teams in recent years had pushed too far out onto those snowfields, lured by what seemed like easier angles, only to step onto cornices, overhanging lips of snow with nothing but air beneath. We had seen the photos. We had read the accident reports. Stay on the spine as much as possible. That was the rule. For hours we climbed in a bubble of light and sound, the narrow cone of our headlamps, the crunch and scrape of crampons, the shallow, labored breathing of people moving at the limits of what their lungs and hearts could handle. Above 7,500 meters, every step felt like wading through wet concrete with a plastic bag over the face. The wind grew stronger as we climbed. Spindrift avalanches, small rivers of snow ripped from the ridge, poured over us, sometimes strong enough to knock us off balance. We moved clipped to a fixed rope in the steeper sections, but even the rope felt like a fragile thing, a thin line between us and the abyss below. Around 8,000 meters, just below the summit dome, the world narrowed even more. The darkness below could have been anything: valleys, other peaks, the curve of the planet. We saw none of it, only the next few meters of snow, the next ice bulge, the next anchor. Here, somewhere on this upper section, other climbers in other seasons had met their end. A Spanish climber with a broken ankle left at around 8,000 meters while his team tried to organize a rescue that never fully reached him. Others swept away by small avalanches triggered by their own footsteps on wind-loaded slabs. On paper, this was just the final few hundred vertical meters. In reality, it was where the mountain took its share. The wind tore at us now, gusting hard enough to make us plant both axes into the slope and wait it out. The summit dome, an apparently gentle swell of snow on the map, was a place of traps, hidden crevasses, thin cornices, and sections where the snowpack had been shaved by the wind into hard, icy plates that barely held crampon points. But sometime late in the morning, after a night that felt like several days, the angle eased. The ridge broadened. We stepped onto a slightly flatter area where the slope no longer rose above us. There is no sharp fang on top of Dhaulagiri, no dramatic, isolated spire like some other peaks. The summit is subtle, a highest point on a rounded dome, marked some seasons by a small stick, a prayer flag, a cluster of footprints. In stormy years, there is nothing at all, just wind whitey, and the knowledge that if you go any further, the ground starts going down again. We gathered there, a small knot of exhausted figures on the seventh highest point on Earth. For a few seconds, the wind dropped just enough for us to look around. To the east, a line of giants, Annapurna, Manaslu. Further away, the faint suggestion of Everest's distant bulk. Down below, an ocean of clouds and unseen valleys. No one shouted. No one raised an ice axe. At this altitude, celebration is quiet. We touched the highest snow, took the required few photos, and then the unspoken thought that defines every real summit arrived like a weight. We are only halfway. On Dhaulagiri, descent has killed more than one climber who had already succeeded. They had stood where we were standing, convinced that the hardest part was behind them, then slipped on a small patch of ice, stepped on the wrong side of a cornice, or been hit by a change in weather they were too tired to fight. We turned back into the wind. Our footprints had already started to vanish under fresh spindrift. The fixed ropes, our lifelines on the steepest sections, were half buried in places, whipping sideways under gusts. Down climbing what you just climbed up, with less oxygen in your blood, less strength in your legs, and less focus in your mind, is its own kind of nightmare. Every move is familiar, but now the penalty for one lazy step is even greater because the body is weaker. We descended, anchor to anchor, testing every placement. The ridge felt narrower on the way down, the drop bigger, the margin thinner. More than once, a gust pushed us toward the edge, and only the rope and a buried axe kept us from stumbling into empty air. Somewhere below us lay Camp 3, then Camp 2, then that wide, gear-loaded slope we had crossed so carefully on the way up. The mountain was not done with us. In many seasons, avalanches have struck Dhaulagiri climbers on the way down, when they are tired, slower, and less precise. As we down-climbed, that thought beat in time with our hearts. Up was survival. Down is judgment. We had reached the top of Dhaulagiri. Now we had to find out what the White Mountain thought of that. If this climb and descent are keeping you with the story, please subscribe. We're still a tiny channel trying to grow from 100 to 1,000 people who love this kind of realistic, dark mountaineering tale. And if you're still hanging on this ridge with us, drop a like so YouTube knows there's an audience for something rougher than Everest content. People think the summit is the climax. On Dhaulagiri, the real story starts when you turn your back on it. We left the top in a line, each of us clipping back into the fixed rope, each step downward demanding more concentration than the last. The elation of "we did it" lasted maybe 3 minutes. After that, it was replaced by a heavier feeling. Don't make a mistake now. The upper ridge, which had felt just manageable on the way up, turned into a tightrope under tired legs. Our crampon points scratched at hard, wind-polished snow. The wind, if anything, had increased, driving thin veils of spindrift over the crest and occasionally trying to grab our legs and push us sideways. The rule was simple. 3 points of contact at all times. Feet placed deliberately. Carabiner checked at every anchor. We descended anchor to anchor, passing knots in the rope, briefly unclipping and reclipping under steep bulges where the rope ran around snow mushrooms or over small rock steps. Every time we did it, there was a fraction of a second when we were completely detached. No tether between us and the void below except our own balance. Somewhere near 8,000 meters, the wind dropped for a moment and we saw flashes of what lay beneath us. To the north, the face disappeared into shadow. To the east, the slopes we had refused to camp under fell away in long, smooth expanses of white, the exact kind of terrain where, in past seasons, avalanches had swept across tents at Camp 2 and buried climbers as they waited for better weather. We kept reminding ourselves, stay on the ridge, stay on the spine. Don't take the easy-looking shortcuts. Hours later, Camp 3 finally came into view, small colored bumps perched on tiny ledges, partly rimed with new frost, partly dusted with fresh snow. Reaching those tents felt like reaching an island after swimming across a dark sea. Inside, we collapsed for a few minutes. Boots stayed on, harnesses stayed on. We melted a little snow, drank a few sips, forced down a mouthful or two of food that tasted like cardboard in the thin air. Then came the decision. Stay the night at Camp 3 and descend to Camp 2 in the morning. or keep going now, while there was still some light, trying to get as low as possible before fatigue turned our legs into rubber. We thought about the stories. About climbers who had died high on Dhaulagiri on the descent, not because they were caught in a sudden storm, but because they had simply run out of focus. One misstep on the ridge, one anchor not checked, one abseil set up wrong. We also thought about Camp 2, about the broad slope, the loaded snow, the history of avalanches that had buried tents while people sat inside, trapped by weather. In 2007, two Spanish climbers, Ricardo Valencia and Santiago Sagaste, died when an avalanche swept through Camp 2, wiping out their tent. Other climbers in nearby tents managed to escape, crawling out of the snow in the chaos, but those two never had a chance. They weren't climbing. They were just waiting. In the end, we chose a compromise most high-altitude climbers know well. Rest just long enough to stop shaking, then keep going. We left Camp 3 again, this time heading down for real. The ridge passed in a blur of cautious movements and small, private battles. A foot that slipped but caught again, a moment of dizziness near an edge, a frozen hand that refused to clip a carabiner until we forced it. By the time we reached the upper edge of the broad slopes above Camp 2, the light was fading. The mountain turned from white and blue to gray and black. We turned our headlamps back on and stared down at the familiar expanse of snow. On the way up, we had crossed this zone early in the morning, when the snowpack was still locked in overnight cold. Now it was evening, and the temperature was dropping again. That was good for stability. But we knew that the day's wind had moved snow around, building new slabs we could not see. We spaced out, the rope between us loose, each climber following the track, but with enough distance that if the slope broke, it wouldn't drag the entire rope team with it. Every so often, we still heard that dull, unsettling whump, the mountain exhaling under our feet. I remembered the Spanish climbers pinned in their tent, buried without warning. I remembered expedition notes mentioning other teams that had lost gear or narrowly avoided disaster when a slab cracked just meters from their camp. There is something uniquely terrifying about avalanche risk on the descent. You are more tired, less careful, but the mountain is exactly as unforgiving. It took far too long to cross those slopes back to Camp 2. By the time we saw the faint shapes of our tents, half buried from the day's spindrift, night had fully claimed the mountain. We dug the doors free and crawled inside. The inside of the tent felt like another world, cramped, damp, but safe, at least temporarily. We knew that safety was an illusion, that snow could come down in the dark and erase this camp as easily as it had erased others. But for the moment, the psychological relief was so strong that our bodies finally allowed themselves to start shutting down. People imagine the descent from an 8,000er as a single, clean line from summit to base camp. In reality, it's a series of negotiations, not just with the terrain, but with your own exhaustion, your own judgment, your own will to keep doing the small, careful things that keep you alive. On Dhaulagiri, that negotiation is particularly brutal. The mountain's death statistics show it clearly. Many climbers have lost their lives on its flanks during the descent, either in falls or avalanches, often after a successful summit. They proved they could go up. The mountain proved it could still take them on the way down. We had made it off the summit dome, off the knife edge ridge, and across the loaded slope to Camp 2. But we were not safe. Not yet. Below us lay Camp 1, Base Camp 2, the broken glacier, and the long exit back to the world where people think Everest is the measure of danger. We knew better now. Dhaulagiri had shown us what it does to climbers when they are strongest and when they are weakest, and we still had to find out if it was willing to let us go. Back in the lowlands and when lungs stop burning and fingers start to feel warm again, people always ask the same question. Was it worse than Everest? They expect stories about wind and cold and altitude. They expect dramatic tales about cliff edges and near falls. What they don't expect is a number. Dhaulagiri's story is written in numbers as much as in ice and rock. As of recent counts, roughly 800 climbers have stood on its summit. Around 79 have died in the attempt. That's a fatality to summit ratio of almost 17%, about one death for every 6 successful summits. Put that next to Everest. Everest has had thousands of summits and a few hundred deaths, roughly 3 to 4 deaths per 100 summits, depending on the time frame you choose. Deadly, yes, but not like this. On Dhaulagiri, the mountain's shape and psychology filter out the crowds. It doesn't attract bucket list climbers in matching suits. It attracts smaller teams, often more experienced, who still find themselves in statistics that look like they came from another era, when climbers went to the Himalaya with little more than wool, leather, and luck. Even when you zoom out and look at the broader picture, Dhaulagiri stands out. Between 1950 and 2006, about 2.88% of everyone who went above base camp on Dhaulagiri died, compared to 1.63% across all 8,000-meter peaks in Nepal. In other words, just stepping onto this mountain almost doubles your risk compared to the Himalayan average. The stories behind those numbers are as brutal as the percentages. In 1969, part of an American expedition was wiped out when a huge serac wall collapsed above their camp, sending a thunder of tumbling death down the mountain, scouring snow to bare ice and taking lives with it. The description from that time doesn't sound like a climbing report, it sounds like a battlefield dispatch. In 1998, French climber Chantal Maudoui and Sherpa Ang Chering were killed when an avalanche struck their tent right on the northeast ridge, the same ridge we climbed, the same ridge where we cut platforms and prayed the slopes above would hold. They weren't moving. They weren't caught in some risky maneuver. The mountain simply reached down in the night and erased their camp. In 2014, during a huge storm that hammered central Nepal, at least 43 people died across the Annapurna and Dhaulagiri region, 2 Slovak climbers at Dhaulagiri base camp among them, along with local guides and yak herders. They weren't high on the ridge. They weren't near the summit. They were at base camp, the place people like to call safe. And in 2024, 5 Russian climbers fell to their deaths on Dhaulagiri, a stark reminder that even in an era of better equipment and forecasting, the mountain still finds ways to punish mistakes and bad luck. Add all that up, and you start to see why old Sherpas in Kathmandu lowered their voices when the conversation shifted from Everest to Dhaulagiri. You also start to understand the quiet arrogance of the statistics. This mountain, with fewer summits and less fame, kills at a rate that would be scandalous if it happened on Everest. But Everest is a mirror for human ambition. Dhaulagiri is an X-ray. Everest demands money, logistics, and the ability to endure time in the death zone. Dhaulagiri demands the same and then adds avalanche hazard, steeper ice, more objective risk, and far fewer people around to help when things go wrong. On paper, Everest is taller, your lungs hurt more, your body decays faster in the death zone, but on Dhaulagiri you can die much lower, on slopes that look benign, in camps that look well chosen, in storms that don't make global news. As I sat back home reading those numbers again, fresh from the climb, I realized something uncomfortable. We had not beaten Dhaulagiri. We had slipped through a narrow gap in its tolerance. The avalanche that buried 2 Spaniards at Camp 2 could have happened in our season. The serac that crushed the American team in 1969 could have waited 50 more years. The storm that killed trekkers in 2014 could have shifted its track slightly north. What made the difference? A few days, a few degrees of wind, a few tiny decisions, where to pitch a tent, which side of the ridge to follow, whether to push for the summit or wait. Those are things you can control, up to a point. Beyond that point, the death rates tell you the rest. If you've made it this far into Dhaulagiri's numbers and ghosts, consider subscribing. We're still under 1,000 people here, trying to build a community that actually likes this level of detail and darkness, not just Everest thumbnails. And if these stats hit you harder than the usual Everest danger cliches, hit the like button so this video reaches more people who have no idea peaks like Dhaulagiri even exist. Looking back from the safety of a screen, it's easy to think Dhaulagiri was just another hard 8,000er. It isn't. It's built, shaped, and positioned to hurt you in ways Everest rarely does. Start with the objective hazards. Dhaulagiri's northeast ridge and surrounding faces are riddled with seracs, crevasses, and avalanche zones, not in 1 or 2 famous spots, but strung almost continuously along the normal route. The approach crosses a broken glacier under high Serac cascades. The slopes to Camp 2 lie below wind-loaded faces. The ridge above Camp 2 is narrow, exposed, and often rimed with fragile cornices that can snap under a single careless step. The weather makes all of that worse. Dhaulagiri sits exposed to ferocious winds that slam straight into its ridges, often at near hurricane force, stripping some areas down to hard ice while dumping snow into others, building slabs where none existed a day before. The mountain is notorious for rapid changes in conditions. A day that starts cold but manageable can turn into a whiteout by afternoon, burying tracks and loading slopes just as you are trying to descend. Then there's the terrain itself. Even the normal northeast ridge involves sustained technical climbing, steep ice, unstable glaciers, and long sections where you have to perform at a high technical level while already exhausted from altitude. Guides who work both peaks say it bluntly. Everest requires stamina and mental fortitude. Dhaulagiri demands that plus real technical skill under pressure. That's why so many of its tragedies don't happen in spectacular summit day storms, but in more mundane situations. Climbers buried in their tents at Camp 2 by avalanches pouring off slopes that always looked fine before. Others falling on descent in marginal visibility. Their bodies later retrieved from steep gullies or crevasse fields. Accidents at base camp and on the approach, when freak storms and avalanches sweep across areas that most people mentally file under safe. Statistically, all of this adds up. Lists of deaths on the 8,000ers consistently place Dhaulagiri in the group of most dangerous peaks, with a death-to-summit ratio far worse than Everest and higher than many better-known giants. Analyses of true deadliest mountains almost always included alongside Annapurna and K2, precisely because of its unpredictable glacial structure, huge ice cliffs, Serac avalanches, and violent storms. Even the trekking circuit around it is considered far more serious and isolated than the classic Everest base camp trek. Guides rate the Dhaulagiri circuit as strenuous to high advanced, equivalent to a 910 in difficulty compared to around 610 for EBC, citing dangerous terrain, extreme isolation, and sustained altitude even for people who never set foot on the main peak. In the end, what makes Dhaulagiri feel more predatory than Everest is not just the numbers, but the way those numbers are created. Everest's dangers are concentrated in a few famous places under the eyes of the world. Dhaulagiri's hazards are spread like mines across the entire route, on the glacier, under the easy slopes, on the ridge, in the camps, in the weather. It doesn't wait for you at one bottleneck. It watches you from every angle and waits for you to get tired, distracted, or just unlucky. Dhaulagiri doesn't have the media machine of Everest. It doesn't have endless documentaries or glossy summit reels. What it has are fragments, reports, rescue notes, climbers' journals, voices scattered across decades that all circle the same truth. This mountain takes what it wants. One of the earliest voices calls it outright, the Mountain of Storms. In a 1960 account, climbers describe being high on Dhaulagiri when the weather turned from difficult to impossible in minutes. Clouds wrapped around the summit pyramid like a closing fist. Winds blasted them with ice crystals that stung faces like needles, freezing beards and eyelashes solid in seconds. They pushed for what they thought was the summit, only to realize in that dim, swirling white that they were heading toward a secondary top while the real peak sat still out of reach. In the end, they were forced back, battered, half-blind, knowing that one more hour in that maelstrom might have been fatal. Another voice comes from 1969, from an American expedition that tried to force its way up Dhaulagiri with the tactics of the era, siege-style SAO heavy camps, and the belief that enough rope and manpower could bend any mountain to the team's will. They advanced high, fixed lines, left camps in exposed places. Then a serac collapsed. A thunder of tumbling death swept down, ripping tents, smashing gear, and reminding everyone in earshot that Dhaulagiri's ice architecture is not a backdrop. It's an active, shifting weapon. Fast forward to the modern era, and the pattern continues. In 2007, Spanish mountaineers Ricardo Valencia and Santiago Sagaste, both highly experienced on 8,000ers like Cho Oyu, Gasherbrum Tsao, Makalu, and Nanga Parbat, set their camp too on what should have been a safe slope while they waited out a storm. They never left the tent. An avalanche poured down from above, buried the camp, and killed them where they lay. Their teammates dug for them in the aftermath, dragging other climbers from the snow. But for those two, the rescue came too late. Expertise, previous summits, even perfect logistics, none of it mattered once the slab broke. Then there is Juanjo Gara, a Catalan climber who fell during descent at around 8,000 meters in 2013 and broke his ankle. At first, the accident was described as a little problem, something a strong, experienced alpinist could outlast while his teammates organized a rescue. He spent the night alone high on the mountain, while others descended to gather ropes and oxygen. Helicopter pilot Simone Moro tried to fly as high as possible to help, pushing the machine near its ceiling to around 7,500 meters, but could not see him. For 4 days, Juanjo fought in the thin air, his body enduring conditions that would have killed most people in hours. In the end, even after receiving medication and oxygen from Sherpas who managed to reach him, his body finally gave up. Not in a dramatic storm on the summit ridge, but in the drawn-out, sterile horror of being immobilized in the death zone, too high for an easy rescue, too exposed for time to be your ally. More recently, in 2024, 5 Russian climbers died on Dhaulagiri in 2 separate incidents, one involving a fall, and another likely linked to the brutal terrain and weather on the mountain's flanks. Their deaths rippled briefly through news feeds around the world and then vanished under the usual noise. But in the community of high-altitude climbers, they were another grim reminder that Dhaulagiri has not become tamer with better gear and forecasting. And then there are the quieter, less famous voices, the ones in personal blogs and trip reports. One climber calls Dhaulagiri far tougher mentally than physically, describing moments where exhaustion, fear, and altitude stripped away all pretense and left only raw emotion, including anger and tears on the glacier when a partner's ice axe was briefly misplaced. Behind that small story is a larger reality. On a mountain where the margin is this thin, every piece of gear and every decision matters, and everyone knows it. All of these testimonies, from storm-blinded expeditions in the 1960s to modern teams with satellite forecasts and rescue helicopters, point to the same conclusion. Dhaulagiri is not just a high number and a beautiful pyramid. It is a system of stacked risks, storms that gather without warning, seracs that fail without sound, avalanches that erase camps, terrain that punishes even small mistakes on descent. When you stand on its summit, the voices of those who didn't come back are not audible. But when you read their stories later, down in the safety of the valley, you understand that every calm day you enjoyed on the mountain could have been something else entirely if the timing had shifted by a few hours. We got a slim slice of good fortune. Many others did not. If hearing these real climbers' stories from Dhaulagiri hits harder than generic Everest danger talk, please subscribe. This channel is still tiny, and these niche, long-form survival stories only reach more people if there's a core crew backing them. And if you're still watching here in Chapter 9, drop a like so the algorithm understands there's an audience for the mountains that don't make the front page. When you step off the glacier and back onto dirt for the first time, Dhaulagiri almost feels like a bad dream. Grass under your boots, real air in your lungs, the sound of water that isn't frozen solid. On the trek out, the mountain stays behind you, but it doesn't let go. Every time I turned around for a last look, the white mountain towered above the valley, isolated, cold, and strangely indifferent to the fact that we were among the ones it had allowed to leave. In the villages, people had heard we'd summited. There were smiles, handshakes, cups of tea pressed into tired hands. They said, "Congratulations," the way you do when someone returns from something far away and dangerous. But the older men, the ones who remembered more than one bad season, didn't only talk about success. They talked about storms that had taken tents from the glacier, about avalanches that had swept across base camp, about foreigners who went up the valley and never came back down. Back in Kathmandu, the conversation tilted immediately toward comparison. People couldn't help it. So, they asked, how was it compared to Everest? The easy answer would have been shorter, wilder, emptier. But that's not the real answer. Everest is higher, yes. Its jet stream is savage, its death zone longer. But Everest has infrastructure, fixed ropes, well-mapped routes, crowds, Sherpa support, helicopters ready to fly when the weather allows. It is still deadly, but its risk has been partially industrialized, packaged into something that can be measured and managed up to a point. Dhaulagiri is not like that. From the first ascent in 1960 by the Swiss-Austrian Nepali team led by Kurt Diemberger and his partners, the mountain was considered impossible, devil difficult. It took them on with siege tactics, ropes, camps, and stubbornness. And even then, the climb remained tricky and dangerous thanks to broken glaciers and heavy, unstable snow. For decades afterwards, only a handful of climbers touched the summit each year. By 2020, 63 years after the first ascent, a total of just 550 people had successfully stood on top of Dhaulagiri. In roughly the same time frame, Everest collected more summits in a single decade than Dhaulagiri has seen in its entire recorded history. That difference matters. It means the death statistics aren't smoothed out by thousands of easy seasons. It means that every accident, the serac collapses, avalanche buried camps, falls on descent, storm-trapped climbers in the death zone, has a larger impact on the ratio. It also means that each ascent feels less like participating in a system and more like negotiating personally with something wild. One expedition leader who spent 11 days pinned high on Dhaulagiri under bad weather described the mountain as wild and heavy, with its own mores, calling the entire climb very dangerous, even by Himalayan standards. He talked about losing 15 kilograms, about feeling like there was no skin left on my skeleton, about being literally rocked by the wind on exposed slopes. That isn't just suffering, it's a description of being pushed right up against the line where your body and judgment start to unravel. It's easy to say Everest isn't the worst as a YouTube title. It's something else to feel, in your bones, the logic behind that statement. On Dhaulagiri, we saw avalanche paths that intersect the normal route more than once, especially around Camp 2. Serac fields above the glacier approach and high on the mountain that have collapsed in previous seasons with almost no warning, wiping out tents and lives. Weather patterns that shifted from climbable to suicidal in less than half a day, forcing entire seasons to be canceled because conditions are simply too dangerous for guides to continue. We also saw what those conditions do to people. We saw how a broken ankle at 8,000 meters turned a strong climber like Juanjo Gara into a casualty over 4 days, despite oxygen, medication, and a helicopter pilot pushing the limits of aircraft and human judgment to try to reach him. We saw how 2 experienced Spaniards, with multiple 8,000ers behind them, died quietly in their tent at Camp 2 when a slab let go in the night. We saw how, in 2024, 5 Russians fell to their deaths on its flanks in what should have been an era of safer Himalayan climbing. Put that into plain language. Dhaulagiri is not just higher risk on paper, it's higher risk in the very parts of the mountain where most climbers let their guard down. On the way down, in camp, below the summit, below the fame. So yes, when people ask if it was worse than Everest, the honest answer is, in all the ways that matter for survival, Dhaulagiri felt more dangerous. Not because it's higher, not because it's more famous, but because on Everest, you can sometimes buy down the risk with money, infrastructure, and support. On Dhaulagiri, the mountain still feels like it belongs to storms, avalanches, and a small, stubborn group of climbers who are willing to accept that the death-to-summit ratio is closer to 1 in 6. When we finally reached the last village on the way out and turned back for a final look, clouds were already gathering around the summit. The White Mountain was wrapping itself back in its usual armor of wind and snow. We had come to Dhaulagiri thinking we were chasing a story deadlier than Everest. What we found was something else. A reminder that there are still places on this planet where statistics, storms, and silence combine into a kind of honesty that no crowded queue on the Hillary step can match. We left footprints on its summit dome. The next storm erased them. The mountain stayed. Dhaulagiri looks innocent from far away. Just a clean white triangle over Nepal's western horizon, the White Mountain that seems almost too perfect to be truly hostile. But if Everest is the mountain everyone knows by name, Dhaulagiri is the one that quietly earns the respect and fear of the people who actually read the statistics and the accident reports. Across more than 6 decades of climbing, roughly 550 or 800 people have stood on its 8,167-meter summit, while around 70-80 have died on its flanks. That puts its fatality-to-summit ratio near 15 to 17%. About 1 death for every 6 successful summits, a rate several times higher than Everest. Guides, climbers, and analysts consistently place Dhaulagiri in the same breath as Annapurna and K2 when they talk about the most dangerous 8,000ers on Earth, precisely because of this brutal mix of high altitude, technical terrain, and unforgiving objective hazards. The danger is not concentrated in one photogenic bottleneck or a single notorious icefall. It's spread along the entire climb. The approach crosses a broken glacier under hanging seracs that have killed climbers even at or near base camp in bad storm years. The slopes to Camp 2 sit directly beneath avalanche paths that have buried tents and taken experienced mountaineers in the middle of the night, including 2 highly accomplished Spaniards in 2007. Higher up, the northeast ridge narrows into exposed, corniced sections where a misstep or a hidden fracture in the snow can send someone thousands of meters down the face. Even summits don't guarantee survival. Descents on Dhaulagiri have claimed people like Juan Hogara, who broke his ankle near 8,000 meters and died despite oxygen, medication, and extraordinary rescue attempts. Add to that the weather. Dhaulagiri forms a major wall between the wet monsoon air of the south and drier air to the north, which helps generate the violent storms and wind systems that earned it nicknames like the Mountain of Storms and the Wild Mountain. Wind can strip ridges to blue ice while loading lee slopes with fragile slabs in a single day, and summit pushes are regularly abandoned or reversed because the jet stream drops without warning onto the upper ridges. Unlike Everest, where heavy infrastructure and large teams can sometimes buffer individuals from the worst consequences of poor timing, Dhaulagiri remains relatively lonely and exposed. Far fewer climbers, less commercial support, and a much smaller margin for rescue or error. When you put all of this together, the comparison that framed esta historia, Everest isn't the worst. Deixa de ser clickbait e vira diagnóstico. Everest is higher and more famous, but Dhaulagiri, with its broken glaciers, avalanche-prone camps, storm-hunted ridges, and harsh numbers, is the kind of peak that reminds you how thin the line really is between epic summit story and name in a memorial list. If you want more stories like this, about peaks that quietly outkill Everest, about forgotten disasters and survival in the real death zones, please subscribe now. It's a small click for you, but it's huge for a small channel trying to reach those first 1,000 people who actually care about this level of detail. And if this Dhaulagiri series gave you chills, hit the like button and drop a comment saying which 8,000er you want to see next, Kangchenjunga, Broad Peak, Manaslu 2012, or another Everest shadow nobody talks about. That engagement tells the algorithm there is an audience for the darker side of high altitude, and it literally helps decide if the next story gets made.